Some men build empires the way storms build silence, by destroying everything gentle enough to trust them. Duke Caedric Vale ruled the northern territories with an iron certainty that terrified allies and enemies alike. Yet the only battlefield where he ever truly lost was the one he refused to acknowledge existed, the quiet war inside his own home, where a woman he owned but never loved stood watching him choose destruction over mercy. If you stay until the very end of this story, you will understand exactly how that choice consumed everything he built. Black rain hammered against the stained glass windows of Ravenwyck Castle with the steady rhythm of a funeral drum, and Duchess Seraphine Vale stood motionless beneath a cathedral of chandeliers, watching another woman cradle her husband's hand like a trophy won in war. The ballroom stretched across the entire western wing of the castle. Firelight crawled over marble floors polished by generations of servants trained to move without sound, without personality, without the dangerous luxury of opinions. Crystal glasses caught the amber glow and threw fragments of light across aristocratic faces arranged in careful masks of enjoyment. Every smile in the room was a negotiation. Every laugh was a concession. The air smelled of oak smoke, champagne, and old money that had stopped caring about the difference between elegance and cruelty 3 bloodlines ago. At the center of it all stood Duke Caedric Vale, tall, broad-shouldered, silver-gray eyes that evaluated every human being in his proximity the way a weapons dealer evaluates inventory. He wore black military-cut formal attire tailored so precisely it looked like armor disguised as fashion. When he spoke, conversations around him died instantly, not because his voice carried violence, because his silence always carried more. Men feared Caedric Vale the way sailors fear open water at night. Not because they understood the danger beneath the surface, because they understood that understanding would not save them. Women desired him for the same reason certain people are drawn toward cliff edges. Something about the proximity to destruction felt more honest than safety ever could. He controlled iron mines across 3 northern provinces, shipping ports along the Greymarch coast, and enough privately funded military power to make the crown lose sleep during treaty negotiations. His fortune was not inherited. It was engineered, welded together from collapsed rival estates, absorbed trade monopolies, and political marriages designed with the emotional warmth of architectural blueprints. Seraphine had been one of those blueprints. She married Caedric at 19 because her father's estate was hemorrhaging debt, and the alternative was public ruin. Caedric married her because her family name carried 3 centuries of aristocratic legitimacy that his self-made dynasty lacked. Love had never entered the contract. Possession had. And for 7 years, Seraphine survived inside that possession the way certain flowers survive beneath concrete, slowly, painfully, reaching toward light that never quite arrived. Tonight she wore pale ivory silk that made her look like something fragile, surrounded by predators, which was precisely what she was. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that revealed the architecture of exhaustion beneath her composure. Beautiful in the way that suffering sometimes makes people beautiful. Not because pain improves anything, but because endurance has a texture the untested can never replicate. And standing across the ballroom floor, still holding Caedric's arm like a declaration of territorial conquest, was Celestine Moreau. Emerald silk. Auburn hair arranged to suggest both aristocratic restraint and the deliberate absence of it. A smile sharpened by cruelty, the way a blade is sharpened by repeated contact with things it is designed to cut. Celestine was not noble by birth. She had crawled into Caedric's orbit through the court's lower ranks. A minor diplomat's daughter with extraordinary beauty and a survival instinct that recognized weakness the way hunting dogs recognize wounded prey. She became Caedric's mistress 11 months ago. Within 6 months, she had more influence over household decisions than Seraphine had accumulated in 7 years of marriage. That fact alone told Seraphine everything she needed to understand about the architecture of her own disposability. "Duchess," the voice came from behind Seraphine's left shoulder. She turned to find Lady Hargrove, an elderly noblewoman whose family had served Ravenwyck since before Caedric's grandfather seized the territory. "Lady Hargrove, you should eat something, my dear. You look pale." "I always look pale at these events." "Yes, but tonight you look pale in a way that suggests decisions." Seraphine studied the old woman carefully. Lady Hargrove's eyes held the specific intelligence of someone who had survived 4 decades inside aristocratic courts by understanding exactly when to speak and when to disappear. "What kind of decisions?" Seraphine asked. "The kind that changed the direction of rivers," Lady Hargrove replied quietly. Then she touched Seraphine's wrist once, gently, and walked away without another word. Seraphine watched her go. Then she felt a small hand tug at her gown. She looked down. Caedric Vale, 6 years old, silver-gray eyes identical to his father's, dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that made him look simultaneously older and more vulnerable than any child his age should. He wore a miniature formal suit that someone had clearly forced him into, and his expression carried the particular stillness of a boy who had already learned that loud emotions invited punishment. "Mother," he said quietly, "that woman is coming." Seraphine's spine straightened. Celestine was crossing the ballroom floor, champagne glass balanced between fingers, that moved with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to performing elegance rather than possessing it. Behind her trailed 2 minor nobles, whose loyalty shifted with the precision of wind vanes, responding to whatever storm currently dominated the landscape. She stopped 3 feet from Seraphine. The surrounding conversations did not quite stop, but they softened. The way an audience lowers its voice when it senses the performance is about to reveal something worth remembering. "Duchess Vale," Celestine said, her tone balanced perfectly between courtesy and condescension. "I did not expect to see you downstairs tonight. Caedric mentioned you were feeling unwell." Caedric was mistaken. "He rarely is." The words landed like a slap wrapped in silk. Several nearby nobles exchanged glances. Seraphine felt the heat of observation pressing against her skin from every direction. Then Celestine's gaze dropped to Cassian. The boy stood completely still beside his mother's gown, small fists clenched at his sides. He did not look away from the woman studying him. Most children would have hidden behind their mother's dress. Cassian simply watched, absorbing everything with those unsettling gray eyes that reflected the firelight with a calm that had no business existing inside a 6-year-old. Celestine tilted her head slightly. "Your child means nothing," she said. The room fell silent, not gradually, instantly, the way sound vanishes when a blade is drawn in a space where weapons were not expected. Celestine held Seraphine's gaze without blinking. The cruelty in her expression was not theatrical, it was structural. Built into the foundation of who she was, the same way load-bearing walls are built into architecture. Remove them, and everything collapses. Seraphine's throat tightened. She looked across the ballroom toward Caedric. He stood near the enormous stone fireplace, whiskey glass motionless in his hand. He had heard. The acoustics of the ballroom guaranteed it, and the sudden silence had reached every corner. Nobles around him watched carefully, waiting for the Duke's response. Caedric looked at Seraphine, then at Celestine. Then he turned back to the man beside him and resumed his conversation as though nothing had happened. That silence, the silence of a father choosing political convenience over his own son's dignity, shattered something inside Seraphine that had been cracking for 7 years. Not her heart. Hearts break and reassemble. This was deeper. This was the structural collapse of the last illusion holding her loyalty together. The belief that somewhere inside Caedric Vale, beneath the control and the dominance and the relentless calculation, a human being still existed who was capable of protecting the people closest to him. That belief died in the 3 seconds it took Caedric to turn away. Cassian looked up at his mother. His eyes were dry. "I want to leave," he said. Seraphine took his hand. "Yes," she whispered. "So do I." They left the ballroom without permission, without announcement, without the careful political choreography that departures from Ravenwyck events normally required. Seraphine walked Cassian through corridors lined with portraits of dead Vales, who stared down at them with painted eyes, carrying the same cold authority the living ones wielded. The stone walls absorbed their footsteps. The castle smelled of centuries, damp rock, burning wood, iron, and something underneath all of it that might have been grief compressed into architecture. She bathed Cassian in silence. She dressed him for bed in silence. She sat beside him until his breathing steadied and his small body surrendered to sleep with the reluctant trust of someone who had already begun learning that the world did not deserve that surrender. Then she stood in the doorway of his chamber for a long time, watching moonlight cross his face, and something rearranged itself permanently inside her chest. Not revenge? Not yet. Survival. The specific, terrible clarity of a woman who has finally accepted that the institution she married into will never protect her child, which means she must become the protection herself, regardless of what that transformation costs. 2 hours later, she stood alone in the eastern tower overlooking the Black Sea cliffs beneath Ravenwyck. The rain had stopped. Fog rolled across the water like something alive and searching. The air tasted of salt, cold iron, and the particular loneliness that exists only in places built for dominance rather than habitation. Behind her, the door opened. Caedric entered carrying the scent of whiskey, smoke, and the invisible residue of conversations designed to consolidate power rather than communicate meaning. He stopped 6 feet from her, close enough to assert authority, far enough to maintain the emotional distance he used the way other men used armor. "You embarrassed the household tonight," he said. His voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a man who had trained himself to deliver cruelty in the same register other people use for weather observations. Seraphine turned toward him slowly. The moonlight caught her face at an angle that stripped away the careful composure she normally wore like protective covering. What remained underneath was not weakness. It was the specific exhaustion of someone who has been performing resilience for so long that the performance itself has become a form of suffering. "No," she whispered. "Your mistress did." Caedric's jaw hardened. The muscles along his temples flexed once, visibly, the way they always did when someone challenged his version of reality. "Celestine knows her place. She knows your bed. That is not the same thing." The words hung between them like a blade suspended at the exact height required to draw blood. Caedric stared at her. In 7 years of marriage, Seraphine had never spoken to him with that particular texture of controlled fury. She had argued, she had pleaded, she had gone silent for weeks, but she had never stood in front of him and used precision the way he used it, as a weapon rather than a request. "Careful," he said quietly. "Why? What happens if I am not careful, Caedric? You replace me. You already have. You humiliate me in public? That happened tonight. You take my son and raise him to become another version of you? That is the only threat I have left to fear, and I promise you, I fear it enough to do whatever becomes necessary to prevent it." Caedric stepped closer. "You are speaking to the Duke of Ravenwyck. I am speaking to the father of my child, if that title still means anything to you." Silence. The sea crashed against the cliffs far below with the rhythmic indifference of something that had been destroying rock for millennia and would continue long after every empire above it collapsed. Caedric studied his wife the way he studied military maps, searching for vulnerabilities, strategic weaknesses, points of leverage. But what he found instead was something he had not anticipated: absence. The fear that had lived inside Seraphine's eyes for 7 years was gone. Not hidden, not suppressed, evaporated, replaced by something harder and quieter and infinitely more dangerous than anything fear had ever produced. She no longer looked like a woman trying to save her marriage. She looked like someone preparing to survive without it. "Cassian is my heir," Caedric said. "He stays. Cassian is my son. He matters. He matters when I decide he matters. No, he matters because he exists, and the fact that you cannot understand the difference is why this empire will eventually destroy itself." Caedric's hand moved. Not toward her, toward the stone wall beside the window, where his knuckles pressed hard enough to whiten the skin across his bones. The gesture was involuntary, the physical manifestation of an emotion he refused to name because naming it would require acknowledging its existence. An acknowledgement was a form of vulnerability his entire identity had been constructed to prevent. "You overestimate your importance," he said, "and you underestimate your son's." She walked past him toward the door. He did not stop her. Not because he chose restraint, because something in her posture communicated a boundary he recognized instinctively, even though he would never admit recognizing it. The boundary between a person who can still be controlled through intimidation and a person who has crossed into the territory beyond fear, where threats stop functioning as currency. At the doorway, she paused without turning around. I loved you once. Did you know that? The question struck the air with the quiet violence of a confession delivered to someone incapable of receiving it. I loved you before I understood what you were, before I watched you choose power over every single person who tried to matter to you. And the worst part was not that you chose power. The worst part was watching you convince yourself that power was all that existed. She left. Caedric stood alone in the tower for a long time. The moonlight moved across the floor the way time moves across men who refuse to change, slowly, indifferently, without any interest in whether they notice its passage. He poured whiskey from a crystal decanter kept on the stone ledge and drank it standing at the window overlooking the cliffs where Ravenwyck's foundations met the sea. Below him, the water churned white against black rock. The castle had been built on this edge deliberately. His grandfather understood that fortifications visible from the water communicated something language could not: permanence, inevitability. The specific arrogance of structures designed to outlast the civilizations that created them. Caedric had inherited that arrogance the way other men inherit eye color. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, the arrogance tasted like something borrowed rather than owned. He thought about Cassian. The boy's stillness bothered him. Not because stillness was weakness. Caedric valued composure above almost every other trait. What bothered him was the quality of the stillness. Cassian did not freeze from fear the way intimidated children freeze. He observed from calculation. He absorbed information with the systematic patience of someone cataloging data for future use. That should have made Caedric proud. Instead, it made his chest tighten in a way he associated with tactical error, the sensation of recognizing a threat after it has already positioned itself inside your perimeter. His own son. A threat. The fact that his mind categorized a 6-year-old boy as a strategic concern told a truth about Caedric Vale that no amount of whiskey could dilute. Somewhere during the years of empire building and dominance and the systematic elimination of vulnerability from every relationship in his life, the machinery designed to protect him had consumed the parts of him capable of connection. He could evaluate human beings with terrifying accuracy. He could predict betrayal 3 moves before it happened. He could build coalitions, dismantle rivals, and engineer political landscapes with the precision of a man who understood that power was not a goal, but an environment, something you constructed around yourself until the outside world could no longer reach you. But he could not sit beside his own child without calculating leverage. He could not look at his own wife without assessing liability. And he could not hear the words, "Your child means nothing," spoken about his son in his own home without responding, because responding would require admitting that the words caused damage, and admitting damage meant acknowledging that something inside the Duke of Ravenwyck was still soft enough to wound. Caedric finished the whiskey. He set the glass on the ledge, and he made a decision that would eventually destroy everything he controlled. He decided Seraphine's defiance was a problem to be managed, rather than a warning to be understood. 2 days later, the political machinery of Ravenwyck shifted. Celestine Moreau received formal authority over household operations, a power traditionally reserved exclusively for the Duchess. The announcement arrived not through public ceremony, but through bureaucratic implementation, the way Caedric preferred to execute changes that carried emotional consequences. Documents appeared. Seals transferred. Servants received new chains of command delivered by administrative officers who performed their duties with the practiced neutrality of people trained to separate moral judgment from professional function. Seraphine learned of the transfer from her own handmaid, a young woman named Marin, whose family had served the Vale household for 2 generations. "I am sorry, Duchess," Marin said, standing in Seraphine's private chambers with trembling hands and eyes that carried the specific helplessness of someone caught between loyalty and self-preservation. The documents were signed this morning. Seraphine sat in a chair beside the window overlooking the frozen gardens. Snow had begun falling across the northern territories early that year, transforming the landscape into something that looked peaceful from a distance and treacherous up close, exactly like Ravenwyck itself. "Who witnessed the transfer?" Seraphine asked quietly. "Lord Chancellor Orwyn," and 2 magistrates from the Eastern Court. Seraphine nodded once. Marin? Yes, Duchess? From this point forward, I need you to watch everything. Every document Celestine signs, every servant she dismisses, every visitor she receives after midnight. Can you do that for me? Marin's hands stopped trembling. Something shifted in the young woman's posture. The small, almost imperceptible realignment that occurs when a person realizes they are being asked to serve a purpose rather than simply follow instructions. Yes, she said, I can do that. It will be dangerous. Everything inside this castle is dangerous, Duchess. At least this would be dangerous for a reason. Seraphine looked at the girl, really looked at her, and recognized something she had almost forgotten existed inside Ravenwyck's walls. Courage that was not performing. Over the following weeks, winter deepened, and the political landscape around Ravenwyck darkened with it. Lucien, the crown's intelligence minister, dispatched envoys to the northern territories requesting financial disclosures that Caedric had successfully deflected for over a decade. Military commanders along the eastern borders submitted expense reports revealing equipment shortages that contradicted the Duke's public declarations of military readiness. 3 merchant houses severed trade agreements, citing unpaid debts the duchy had been servicing through creative accounting that was rapidly approaching the boundary between financial strategy and fraud. And Celestine thrived. She reorganized kitchen staff to eliminate anyone loyal to Seraphine. She adjusted guest lists for political dinners, removing families historically aligned with the Duchess's lineage. She moved through the castle's social ecosystem, the way invasive species move through environments, replacing established structures with her own patterns, until the original architecture became unrecognizable. She is not simply a mistress, Elias Thornmere said. The meeting took place inside an abandoned grain cellar 3 miles east of Ravenwyck, beneath a sky that looked bruised with approaching storms. Thornmere was 54, lean as stripped wire, with scarred hands and the specific weariness of a man who had spent decades watching power corrupt the people he served. He had been Caedric's chief war strategist until 4 years ago, when he made the mistake of presenting the Duke with intelligence reports documenting corruption inside his own court. Caedric dismissed him within 48 hours. She is building a shadow administration, Thornmere continued. Every servant she replaces becomes her intelligence asset. Every noble she cultivates becomes a pressure point she can activate against you. She is not competing with you for Caedric's affection, Seraphine. She is competing with you for Ravenwyck itself. Seraphine pulled her cloak tighter against the cold. Why would Caedric allow it? Because Caedric does not see her clearly. She reflects back to him exactly what he wants to see. Strength without challenge. Loyalty without independence. Desire without the terrifying complication of equality. She makes him feel powerful without requiring him to be good. That is a narcotic no ambitious man has ever successfully resisted. What do I do? Thornmere studied her for a long moment. You stop trying to save your marriage, and you start building something that survives its collapse. Seraphine looked at him. What does that require? Allies outside Ravenwyck, documentation of every illegal transaction the duchy has conducted, and patience that will feel like dying slowly while you wait for the structure to weaken enough to dismantle. How long? Years. Possibly many years. The words settled across Seraphine's shoulders like physical weight. Years. Years of watching Celestine parade through her home. Years of watching Cassian grow up inside a household that treated him as a liability rather than a child. Years of performing obedience while building resistance beneath the surface like roots pushing through stone. I am not strong enough for years, she whispered. Thornmere shook his head slowly. You're not strong enough to survive staying without a plan. That is a different thing entirely. Seraphine rode back to Ravenwyck through falling snow. The castle appeared through the trees like a monster crouching against the cliff edge, black stone walls absorbing the weak winter light until the entire structure looked less like a building and more like a wound carved into the landscape. She dismounted in the eastern courtyard and walked through corridors that smelled of cold stone and burning tallow, passing servants who averted their eyes with the practiced precision of people who understood that visibility inside Ravenwyck was a form of exposure. She found Cassian in the library. The boy sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by books too advanced for his age. Military histories, trade economics, political theory. He was reading the way certain children read when books become the only environment where the world makes sense. Cassian, he looked up. You were gone again, he said. Not accusatory, observational. Yes. The woman told Father you were meeting someone. Seraphine's blood went cold. What woman? Celestine. She told him at dinner. Father did not say anything. He just stopped eating and looked at the table for a long time. Seraphine knelt beside her son. Cassian, listen to me carefully. What did your father do after dinner? He went to his study. He told Commander Ashwick to come immediately. Commander Ashwick? The one who controls the soldiers. Seraphine stood slowly. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was working with the terrible precision that fear produces in people who have lived inside danger long enough to understand its rhythms. Caedric had summoned his military commander. Celestine had reported her absence. The machinery of suspicion was already turning, and once Caedric's paranoia locked onto a target, it did not release. She looked at Cassian. The boy looked back at her with those silver-gray eyes, his father's eyes, and in them she saw something that stopped her breath. Not fear. Recognition. The quiet, devastating recognition of a child who already understood that the two people responsible for his existence were moving toward a collision that would determine whether his life became a story of survival or a casualty of someone else's war. Mother, Cassian said softly, are we in danger? The honesty of the question deserved honesty in return. Yes, Seraphine whispered, we are. Somewhere deep inside the castle, boots echoed against stone floors. Heavy, deliberate, moving in formation. Commander Ashwick's soldiers were already searching. The boots grew louder. Seraphine grabbed Cassian's wrist and pulled him away from the library floor, where books lay scattered like evidence of a childhood that was running out of time. The boy did not cry. He did not ask questions. He simply moved with his mother through the candlelit corridor with the terrifying efficiency of a child who had already internalized that hesitation inside Ravenwyck carried consequences measured in bruises and silence. They reached the servants' passage behind the eastern stairwell, a narrow corridor hidden behind a tapestry depicting the Vale family's military conquests, stitched in gold thread by women whose names no one remembered. Seraphine pressed her back against the cold stone and held Cassian against her ribs. His heartbeat hammered through his small chest into hers. 2 rhythms, 1 fear. Boots passed, 4 soldiers, maybe 5. Moving with the disciplined cadence of men executing orders they did not need to understand because obedience paid better than curiosity. Seraphine counted the footsteps until they faded down the adjacent corridor. Then she exhaled. Where are we going? Cassian whispered. Somewhere your father will not look tonight. He will look everywhere. The boy said it without drama, without self-pity. He stated it the way someone states the temperature outside, observable fact, immune to wishful thinking. Seraphine looked down at her son in the near darkness. Yes, she said. He will. They moved through the servants' passage to Marin's quarters, a small stone room on the ground floor near the kitchens, furnished with a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and the accumulated scent of bread flour and exhaustion. Marin was awake. She opened the door before Seraphine knocked, which meant she had already heard the soldiers mobilizing. Commander Ashwick sent 6 men to search the east wing, Marin said quickly. 2 more are stationed outside your chambers. The Duke is in his study with the door locked. Celestine? In the west parlor. She had wine brought to her 30 minutes ago. She is waiting. Waiting for what? Marin hesitated. For whatever happens next, Duchess. She set the trap. Now she watches it close. Seraphine knelt and placed both hands on Cassian's shoulders. Stay with Marin. Do not open this door for anyone except me. Do you understand? Cassian's gray eyes searched her face. The firelight from a single candle caught the angles of his expression, and for one terrible moment Seraphine saw Caedric staring back at her. Not the Caedric who existed now, but the younger version she had glimpsed during the first months of their marriage, before ambition consumed everything soft enough to qualify as human. You are going to him, Cassian said. Yes. Why? Because running tonight would confirm every accusation Celestine had planted. Because the soldiers searching the castle were not looking for an escaped wife. They were looking for evidence of conspiracy, and Seraphine's absence from her own chambers would become that evidence. Because Caedric's paranoia functioned like a machine that required fuel to operate, and disappearance was the highest grade fuel available. She could not say any of this to a 6-year-old. Because sometimes the safest place is the last place anyone expects you to go, she said. Cassian considered this. Then he nodded once with the gravity of someone 3 times his age. Be careful, he said. Seraphine kissed his forehead. His skin smelled like parchment and the faint metallic residue of castle air. She stood, looked at Marin, and the young handmaid nodded without needing instructions. Some understandings between women inside dangerous houses do not require language. Seraphine walked toward the Duke's study. The corridor leading to Caedric's private quarters occupied the central spine of Ravenwyck's ground floor, a passage wide enough for 2 armed men to walk abreast, lined with iron sconces that threw shadows long enough to drown in. Portraits of previous Vales watched from the walls with painted eyes that carried judgment the way loaded weapons carry intent. The air was colder here, damper. The castle's ventilation channeled sea wind through internal passages designed centuries ago to prevent fire from spreading, which meant that walking toward the Duke's study always felt like walking toward something exposed and elemental. 2 soldiers stood outside the door. They straightened when they saw her. Duchess Vale, the taller one said. His hand rested on the pommel of his sidearm with the casual readiness of someone trained to transition from stillness to violence without the inconvenience of decision-making. I need to see my husband. The Duke gave orders not to be disturbed. Tell him his wife is here. If he refuses to see me, I will wait in this corridor until morning. Your men can watch me stand here all night. I'm sure Commander Ashwick will appreciate the allocation of military resources to guard a woman in her own home. The soldier blinked. He turned and knocked twice on the study door. Muffled conversation inside. Then the lock turned. The door opened. Caedric's study was a room designed to communicate a single message. The man who occupied it controlled enough of the world to afford the luxury of silence. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with volumes arranged not for reading but for the visual architecture of intellectual authority. A massive oak desk dominated the center. Maps of the Northern Territories hung behind it, annotated with troop positions, trade routes, and financial projections rendered in Caedric's precise handwriting. He sat behind the desk. Whiskey. No glass this time. The bottle itself, half emptied, stood beside a stack of documents bearing official seals Seraphine recognized as military requisition orders. Commander Ashwick stood near the fireplace. A compact man with the build of someone forged by decades of physical conflict and the expression of someone who had long ago stopped distinguishing between duty and damage. He looked at Seraphine the way career soldiers look at complications that fall outside their operational parameters. Caedric did not stand when she entered. "Close the door," he said. She did. The 3 of them occupied the room like points on a triangle. Caedric behind the desk, Ashwick by the fire, Seraphine near the door. The geometry of power arranged itself automatically, placing Caedric at the apex without anyone needing to discuss the arrangement. "Where were you today?" Caedric asked. "Riding." "Where?" "East of the estate, along the river." "Alone?" "Yes." "You're lying." The accusation landed without emphasis. Caedric delivered it the same way he delivered every statement, as settled fact requiring no evidence because his certainty alone constituted proof. Seraphine held his gaze. "I am not." "Celestine observed you leaving through the eastern gate at noon. You did not return until after 4. The eastern river path takes 90 minutes to ride at leisure. That leaves 2 unaccounted hours. I stopped to rest the horse. For 2 hours. The animal was tired. Caedric leaned forward. The chair beneath him creaked. Old wood protesting weight it had carried for too many years. His silver-gray eyes locked onto Seraphine's face with the focused intensity of someone searching for fractures in a surface that appeared intact. "Commander Ashwick," Caedric said without looking away from his wife. "Tell the Duchess what your scouts found." Ashwick cleared his throat. "Fresh tracks along the Eastern Mill Road, 2 riders. one matching the Duchess's horse based on shoe pattern. The second rider came from the direction of the Thornmere estate. The name detonated inside Seraphine's chest like something she had been carrying too carefully for too long. Thornmere. Caedric watched her reaction the way predators watch wounded prey, with patience that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with timing. Elias Thornmere, Caedric said slowly, a man I dismissed for insubordination 4 years ago, a man who accused my own court of corruption, a man who has spent every year since his removal cultivating relationships with political factions that would benefit from my downfall. He stood. The movement was deliberate, controlled. The physical vocabulary of a man who understood that standing during an interrogation shifted the gravitational center of the conversation toward whoever occupied the vertical advantage. And my wife rides to meet him in secret, 2 hours, alone. Caedric, do not. The 2 words cut the air cleanly. Seraphine stopped. Do not say my name as though familiarity protects you, Caedric continued. Do not look at me as though our marriage entitles you to explanations I would not give any other person under suspicion. You are in my house, under my authority, breathing air that belongs to this duchy, and you rode to meet a man who wants to destroy everything I have built. His voice did not rise. It dropped, the way temperature drops before storms that kill livestock and collapse structures, gradually, invisibly, until the damage arrives with a velocity that makes preparation irrelevant. Seraphine felt her survival instincts reorganizing themselves in real time. The old patterns, appeasement, deflection, strategic submission, surfaced automatically, offering themselves like familiar tools. She had used them for 7 years. They had kept her alive. They had kept Cassian fed and sheltered and physically unharmed inside a household where emotional harm was distributed as casually as table settings. But something had changed. The moment in the ballroom, Celestine's voice declaring her son meaningless, Caedric's silence confirming it. Those old tools no longer fit the situation. They had been designed for a woman trying to survive inside a marriage. Seraphine was no longer that woman. She was something the old tools could not accommodate. A mother preparing to extract her child from an environment that was engineering his destruction. So she did something she had never done inside this study. She told the truth. Yes, she said. I met Elias Thornmere. Ashwick shifted his weight near the fireplace. His hand moved closer to the weapon at his belt. Instinct rather than intention. The muscle memory of a man trained to respond to escalation before his conscious mind finished processing it. Caedric went completely still. The stillness of a man who had expected resistance and received confession instead. His entire interrogation strategy had been built around the assumption that Seraphine would deny, deflect, eventually crumble. The architecture of the confrontation was designed to produce guilt through exhaustion. Instead, she handed him the truth like a weapon he had not prepared to receive. Why? He asked. Because I needed to know whether the man who warned you about corruption in your own court was right. And after 7 years of watching you, Caedric, I can confirm that he was. The silence that followed was not empty. It was structural, load-bearing, the kind of silence that holds weight the way bridges hold weight, through tension distributed across carefully engineered pressure points until the load exceeds design capacity and everything fails simultaneously. You are accusing me, Caedric said quietly. I am telling you what I see. What you see. He repeated the words as though tasting them for contamination. And what exactly do you see, Seraphine? From your considerable vantage point of dinner tables and drawing rooms and horseback rides through the countryside, what grand insight has your extensive strategic experience produced? The contempt in his voice was not theatrical. It was foundational, built into the operating system of a man who had constructed his entire identity around the premise that strength was a finite resource. If someone else possessed it, he had less. If his wife demonstrated independent judgment, it diminished his own. If Seraphine saw clearly, it meant he had been seen through, and being seen through was the same as being defeated. I see an empire running on debt, Seraphine said. I see military commanders who have not been paid in 3 months. I see trade alliances dissolving because merchants no longer trust your accounting. I see a mistress who is systematically removing every person inside this household who is loyal to anyone except her. And I see a man so terrified of vulnerability that he would rather destroy his own family than admit he needs help. Caedric crossed the room in 3 strides. He stopped close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the small muscles around his eyes contracting with the effort of containing something enormous behind a surface designed to appear impenetrable. "You think I am afraid," he said. "I think you have been afraid your entire life. I think every empire you built, every alliance you crushed, every person you controlled was another brick in a wall between you and the thing you are most terrified of. And what is that? Being known." The word landed like a blade between his ribs. For one instant, less than a second, measured in heartbeats rather than clock time, something moved behind Caedric's eyes that Seraphine had never seen before. Not anger, not calculation. Something raw, something that looked like the face of a man standing at the edge of recognition, staring down at the truth of himself reflected in water he had spent decades refusing to approach. Then the wall rebuilt itself. The eyes hardened, the jaw set. The physical architecture of dominance reassembled with the speed of a structure engineered specifically for rapid reconstruction after impact. "Commander Ashwick," Caedric said without turning. His voice had flattened into the administrative register used for decisions that carried permanent consequences. "Sir, confine the Duchess to the North Tower. Post guards at every access point. No visitors, no correspondence, no exceptions." Seraphine's blood turned to ice. The North Tower was Ravenwyck's oldest structure, a cylindrical stone column rising from the cliff edge with walls thick enough to muffle screaming and a single window overlooking a 200-foot drop to the rocks below. It had been used as a prison for political enemies during the territory wars. Children in the surrounding villages still told stories about the people who entered the North Tower and emerged years later unable to remember their own names. "Caedric," she said, "the Duchess will remain confined until I determine the full extent of her communications with enemies of this household. I am your wife. You are a liability." The word hit her sternum like a fist, not because it was cruel, because Caedric delivered it with the same emotional registration he used when discussing defective equipment or expired trade contracts. She was not a person being punished. She was a variable being removed from an equation that required simplification. "And my son?" she asked. "Cassian remains in the household, under appropriate supervision." "Whose supervision?" Caedric did not answer. He did not need to. The absence of an answer was the answer. Celestine's supervision. The woman who declared Cassian meaningless would now control his daily existence while his mother sat locked in a stone tower listening to seabirds and the slow erosion of everything she had failed to protect. "Commander," Caedric said. Ashwick stepped forward. He approached Seraphine with the mechanical courtesy of a man performing a duty he recognized as wrong but would execute regardless, because the architecture of obedience he had built his career inside left no structural support for refusal. "Duchess," Ashwick said quietly, "please." Seraphine looked at him. Then she looked at Caedric. Her husband stood behind his desk with both hands pressed flat against the oak surface, fingers spread, bearing weight the way foundations bear weight, invisibly, constantly, with the accumulated pressure of everything constructed above them. His face showed nothing. His body showed everything. The rigid posture, the locked shoulders, the controlled breathing of a man fighting the specific agony of performing a decision his deeper self recognized as catastrophic. He was not imprisoning his wife because he believed she was a traitor. He was imprisoning her because she had seen through him, and the only response his machinery could produce when someone penetrated his defenses was to remove them from proximity. Seraphine understood this. She understood it with the terrible clarity of a woman who had spent 7 years studying the man she married, cataloging his patterns, mapping the geography of his damage until she knew the terrain of his fear better than he did. And that understanding did not help, because understanding a man's damage does not prevent him from inflicting it. Comprehending the origin of cruelty does not reduce its impact. Knowing why someone destroys you is not the same as being able to stop them. "You will lose him," she said, Her voice was barely audible. "If you do this, you will lose Cassian forever. Not because I will take him from you, because he will choose to leave on his own." Caedric's fingers pressed harder against the desk. His knuckles whitened. A vein along his temple surfaced and pulsed with the rhythm of a man whose body was processing emotions his mind refused to acknowledge. "Children do not choose," he said. "This one will." Ashwick took Seraphine's arm, gently, with the careful pressure of someone handling something they suspected might be more valuable than anyone in the room was willing to admit. He walked her toward the door. As she crossed the threshold, she heard Caedric pour another measure of whiskey. The liquid hitting the glass sounded like something small and irreversible. They walked through the corridor in silence. The soldiers flanked them, two ahead, two behind, boots striking stone in synchronized rhythm. The castle was quieter now. Servants had retreated to their quarters, warned by the invisible communication network that exists inside every household governed by fear. They knew something had shifted. They could feel it the way animals feel changes in atmospheric pressure before storms arrive. Not through understanding, but through the ancient biological recognition that danger does not announce itself through language. The North Tower stairwell spiraled upward through stone walls that narrowed with each revolution until the passage felt less like architecture and more like the interior of a throat. Cold air descended from above. The steps were worn concave by centuries of reluctant footsteps. At the top, a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands stood open. Ashwick stopped. "Duchess," he said. He released her arm and stood at attention with the posture of a man trapped between the person he served and the person he suspected deserved better. Seraphine stepped into the chamber. A narrow bed, a wooden chair, a single window overlooking the sea cliffs. The walls were bare stone. No tapestries, no decoration, nothing to absorb the constant sound of wind pressing against the tower like something trying to get inside. She turned to face Ashwick before the door closed. "Commander, I have one question." Ashwick waited. "When you served in the Eastern campaigns, you told Caedric the truth about his supply lines. You warned him that the logistics infrastructure was corrupt and that soldiers were dying from shortages manufactured by his own contractors. He ignored you. Those soldiers died, and you stayed anyway." Ashwick's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes moved, the deep, slow shifting of a man forced to look at a wound he had been avoiding for years. "Why?" Seraphine asked. Ashwick exhaled slowly. "Because I believe the Duke I served was not the same man as the Duke who made that decision." "And now?" The question hung in the stairwell like smoke. Ashwick did not answer. He closed the door. The lock turned with the heavy mechanical finality of something designed to separate people from their own futures. Seraphine stood alone in the tower. Below her, the sea churned against the cliffs with the indifferent rhythm of something that had been destroying foundations for longer than any dynasty had existed. Wind pressed through the single window and moved through her hair and across her face with the intimate brutality of cold that does not care whether the body it touches belongs to a duchess or a prisoner. She placed both hands against the stone wall. The rock was cold enough to hurt. She pressed harder, because the pain was real. And inside Ravenwyck, where every relationship was performance and every conversation was negotiation and every silence carried the weight of calculations designed to preserve power rather than protect people, real things had become almost impossible to find. 3 floors below, in Marin's quarters near the kitchen, Caedric Vale sat on a narrow bed with his hands folded in his lap and his silver-gray eyes fixed on the stone wall opposite. Marin watched him from the doorway. "Your mother will be all right," she said softly. The boy did not look at her. "No," he said. "She will not. But she will survive. There is a difference." Marin stared at the 6-year-old child who had just articulated a distinction most adults spend entire lifetimes failing to recognize. Cassian turned his head slowly and looked at the handmaid with an expression that carried no anger, no fear, no childlike helplessness. What it carried instead was something far more dangerous. Memory. The total, systematic, permanent recording of everything happening inside this castle, stored behind those gray eyes with the precision of someone who understood instinctively that information is the only currency that appreciates in value over time. "Marin," he said. "Yes?" "I need you to show me where my mother kept her documents, the ones she hid before tonight." Marin's breath stopped. "How do you know about those?" Cassian looked at her with the calm patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone who should have already understood. "Because I watched her. I watch everything." Outside the castle walls, snow fell across the northern territories with the silent accumulation of something patient enough to bury entire landscapes without making a sound. And deep inside Ravenwyck, a boy who had been dismissed as meaningless began assembling the architecture of a reckoning that would take 15 years to complete and 3 days to execute. He would remember every name, every insult, every locked door. He would remember the sound of his mother's footsteps being marched away from him through stone corridors by soldiers who served a father too broken to protect the only people who ever tried to love him. And when the time came, he would not need a weapon. He would use the truth, which, in the end, would prove far more destructive than anything the Duke of Ravenwyck had ever feared. Marin did not move for a long time. She stood in the doorway of her own quarters, staring at the 6-year-old boy sitting on her bed with his hands folded and his gray eyes waiting, and the silence between them filled with the specific gravity of a moment where an adult realizes a child has already crossed a threshold. Most grown people spend entire lifetimes avoiding. Cassian was not asking permission. He was informing her of what he intended to do. The question was simply whether she would participate or become irrelevant. "The documents," Marin said slowly. "Your mother hid them in the lining of the blue trunk, the one beneath the winter linens in her dressing chamber." "Not anymore," Cassian said. "She moved them 3 days ago. I watched her carry a leather case to the stable loft and bury it beneath the grain stores in the third stall from the eastern wall." Marin's hands went cold. "You watched her. I watch everything." "Cassian, you're 6 years old." "Yes. And my mother is locked in a tower, and my father put her there because a woman he sleeps with told him to. My age does not change what is happening." The words came out without anger, without childish petulance. They arrived with the flat, devastating precision of observation, stripped of every emotional filter that normally protects children from understanding the machinery of adult cruelty. Cassian had not learned this language from books. He had learned it from 7 years of watching a household where power was the only currency that purchased safety, and where the people who possessed the least of it absorbed the most damage. Marin crossed the room and knelt in front of him. "If your father discovers I helped you, he will dismiss me. My family depends on this position. My mother is ill. My sister has no trade." Cassian looked at her. "If my father discovers nothing, my mother stays in that tower until she becomes someone he no longer needs to fear. And the only reason he would stop fearing her is if she breaks. Do you want to watch that happen?" Marin closed her eyes. The question was not rhetorical. It was mechanical. A lever applied to the precise fulcrum of her conscience with the engineering accuracy of someone who understood instinctively that human beings do not change direction because of moral arguments. They change direction because someone makes the cost of staying still more unbearable than the cost of moving. "No," Marin whispered. "I do not." "Then we go to the stables. Tonight." They moved through the castle's service corridors at 2 in the morning, when the guard rotation left a 12-minute gap between the kitchen passage and the eastern courtyard. Marin knew the timing because she had spent 2 years memorizing it, not for this moment specifically, but because women who live inside dangerous households develop survival cartographies the way sailors develop knowledge of reef positions. You map the dangers not because you plan to use the information. You map them because the alternative is drowning without understanding why. The stables smelled of hay, animal heat, and frozen earth. Cassian moved directly to the third stall from the eastern wall. He pulled grain sacks aside with hands too small for the work, but compensated with a systematic patience that made the physical limitation irrelevant. Beneath the third layer of burlap, his fingers found leather. The case was smaller than Marin expected, dark brown, worn at the edges, sealed with a brass clasp that opened without a key, which meant Seraphine had prioritized accessibility over security. She needed these documents reachable in circumstances that might not afford time for locks. Cassian opened the case. Inside were papers, dozens of them. Financial ledgers copied in Seraphine's careful handwriting, correspondence between Caedric and merchants whose names Marin recognized from household accounts, military supply orders bearing official seals alongside secondary documents showing different numbers, the kind of discrepancies that existed only when someone was maintaining two sets of books. Cassian could not read most of it. The financial language was beyond him, but he studied the pages with the focused attention of someone who understood that comprehension would come later and preservation mattered now. "These need to leave the castle," he said. "How?" "Thornmere. My mother trusted him. He lives east of here." "Cassian, we cannot reach the Thornmere estate. The roads are watched. Your father has patrols on every route within 10 miles. The boy looked at her. "Not every route. The fishing track along the sea cliffs. It floods at high tide but stays passable between 2 and 5 in the morning during winter. My mother used it. I saw the mud on her boots." Marin stared at him. This child, this small, quiet, systematically observant child, who the entire household had dismissed as timid, who Celestine had publicly declared meaningless, who Caedric evaluated as a future asset rather than a present person. This boy had been mapping escape routes by studying the mud on his mother's shoes. "We cannot go tonight," Marin said. "The tide is wrong. Tomorrow night." "And the documents? If anyone searches the stables—" "They will not search the stables. They are searching the east wing. My father thinks in straight lines. He assumes my mother hid things near her own chambers because that is where he would hide things. He does not understand that she learned to think differently because she had to." Marin took the leather case. She held it against her chest the way people hold objects that have become heavier than their physical weight, burdened with consequence, with risk, with the terrible understanding that possession of certain information transforms a person from a bystander into a participant, whether they consent to the transformation or not. "Tomorrow night," she said. They returned to Marin's quarters separately, using different corridors, arriving 4 minutes apart. Cassian climbed back onto the narrow bed and pulled the thin blanket over his legs, and sat with his back against the stone wall, watching the candlelight move across the ceiling. He did not sleep. He sat in the dark and listened to the castle breathing around him. The groaning of old wood, the whisper of wind through stone joints, the distant rhythm of waves against the cliffs below. And he understood something that would define the rest of his life. His father was not evil. His father was trapped. Trapped inside an identity constructed so thoroughly around the premise that strength meant invulnerability, that any crack in the structure threatened total collapse. Caedric could not show mercy because mercy required acknowledging that someone else's pain mattered, and acknowledging someone else's pain required accepting that he was capable of causing it, and accepting that he was capable of causing pain required confronting the possibility that strength built on other people's suffering was not strength at all, but a very elaborate, very expensive, very convincing form of cowardice. Cassian understood this at 6, the way certain children understand mathematics or music, not through instruction, but through an innate capacity for pattern recognition that arrived fully formed, like a sense organ designed to detect frequencies most people cannot hear. He did not forgive his father for it. Understanding is not forgiveness. Understanding is a tool. Forgiveness is a choice. And Cassian Vale, sitting alone in a servant's quarters while his mother sat locked in a tower, and his father sat drinking whiskey in a study surrounded by the architecture of an empire that was slowly consuming itself, was not yet old enough to understand the difference. But he would be. Eventually, he would be. 4 days passed. Inside the North Tower, Seraphine measured time by the movement of light across the stone floor. Morning arrived as a thin blade of gold through the single window. Afternoon expanded it into a rectangle that crawled eastward until it disappeared around 4, when the winter sun dropped below the cliff line and the chamber descended into a darkness so complete it felt architectural, as though the tower had been designed to demonstrate that light was a privilege rather than a right. She ate what the guards brought: bread, cold meat, water, enough to sustain biological function, not enough to sustain anything resembling dignity. On the second day, she tried speaking to the guards. They did not respond. On the third day, she stopped trying. On the fourth day, the door opened and Celestine Moreau walked in. The mistress wore deep burgundy silk that caught the weak afternoon light and held it the way certain fabrics hold color, with an intensity that felt less like beauty and more like aggression. Her auburn hair was arranged with deliberate precision. Her expression carried the particular satisfaction of someone visiting a cage they helped construct. 2 guards remained outside the open door. Celestine stood in the center of the chamber and studied Seraphine the way a collector studies a piece that has lost its value, with distant interest and faint contempt. "You look terrible," Celestine said. Seraphine sat on the narrow bed with her back against the wall. She did not stand. She did not react to the assessment. 4 days of isolation had stripped away the social reflexes that normally governed interactions between women occupying different positions inside the same household. What remained was something leaner, harder, less interested in performance. "Why are you here?" Seraphine asked. "Caedric sent me." Caedric does not send people to do things he considers important. He does them himself. The observation landed with enough accuracy to shift Celestine's expression slightly. A micro-adjustment of the muscles around her eyes that someone less attentive would have missed entirely. "He is occupied with military matters," Celestine said. "He is avoiding me. He is governing. He is hiding behind governance because facing me would require admitting that locking his wife in a tower on the word of his mistress might reflect poorly on his judgment." Celestine crossed her arms. "You think you still matter here?" "I think you would not have come if I did not." The silence that followed had weight, actual, measurable, atmospheric weight, the kind of pressure shift that occurs in rooms where 2 people are engaged in combat that operates entirely through language and the spaces between language. Celestine moved closer. "Let me explain what is happening outside this tower. Cassian is being relocated to the West Wing under my household authority. His education has been restructured. His daily activities are now supervised by staff I personally selected. The boy barely speaks, which frankly makes everything easier." Seraphine's hands went still, every muscle in her body locked into the specific rigidity of a person receiving information that triggers the deepest biological alarm systems, the ones that exist beneath thought, beneath strategy, beneath the civilized architecture of rational response. The ones that belong to the animal underneath, the mother underneath, the organism that recognizes threat to offspring before the conscious mind finishes processing the first sentence. "You will not touch him," Seraphine said. Her voice was quiet, almost inaudible, but the texture of it carried something that made Celestine take one small, involuntary step backward, the instinctive retreat of a body that has registered danger before the mind produces a conscious assessment. "I am not touching him," Celestine said. "I am raising him, since you are clearly unable to do so from inside a locked room. You are isolating him. You are removing every familiar face from his environment and replacing them with strangers who answer to you. You are not raising a child. You are constructing a hostage. I am doing what Caedric asked. Caedric asked you to manage household operations, not to dismantle my son's world piece by piece until the only stability he can find comes from your approval." Celestine smiled. The smile was the worst part, not because it was cruel, although it was, because it was authentic. Celestine genuinely enjoyed this, not in the theatrical way of villains who perform cruelty for an audience, in the private, structural way of someone who had internalized powerlessness so completely during the first decades of her life that the acquisition of control over others produced a sensation indistinguishable from safety. She did not hate Seraphine. Hatred would have required seeing Seraphine as an equal. What Celestine felt was something more clinical, the dispassionate satisfaction of eliminating an obstacle that stood between her and the only form of security she had ever found. Proximity to power, control over the powerful man's household, ownership of the narrative that determined who mattered and who disappeared. "Your son will be fine," Celestine said. "Children adapt, especially quiet ones." Then she turned and walked toward the door. "Celestine." The mistress stopped. "One day," Seraphine said, "the man you are standing beside will do to you exactly what he is doing to me. Not because you deserve it, because it is the only thing he knows how to do. And on that day you will understand that the power you borrowed from him was never yours. It was a leash with better decoration." Celestine did not turn around. She walked through the door. The guards closed it behind her. The lock turned. Seraphine sat motionless on the bed for several minutes. Then she stood, walked to the window, and placed her palms flat against the stone ledge. The sea below churned against the cliffs, black water folding over itself with the rhythmic patience of something that measures time in geological increments rather than human ones. She breathed, in, out, each breath deliberate, each exhalation carrying something away. Not the pain, because pain does not evacuate on command, but the paralysis that pain produces when it combines with helplessness. Seraphine was not helpless. She was confined. Those were different conditions. Confinement restricts the body. Helplessness restricts the mind. And Seraphine's mind was operating with the savage clarity that imprisonment sometimes produces in people who refuse to let their circumstances define their capacity. Marin would move the documents. She trusted that. Cassian would survive. She had to trust that. And when the time came, if the time came, the architecture of accountability she had spent months quietly constructing would function without her direct involvement. Because the most dangerous plans are not the ones that require their architect's presence. The most dangerous plans are the ones designed to operate autonomously, like delayed charges set beneath foundations, triggered not by human decision, but by the inevitable weight of the structure above them. She pressed her forehead against the cold stone, and she waited. Meanwhile, 3 floors below, the Empire continued eating itself. Caedric sat in his study reviewing financial reports that confirmed what Seraphine had told him and what Thornmere had warned him about 4 years ago. The duchy's economic infrastructure was hemorrhaging. Trade revenue had declined 17% across the previous fiscal year. Military expenditures exceeded projections by margins that could no longer be disguised through creative accounting. 3 banking houses in the capital had quietly downgraded Ravenwyck's credit standing, which meant that the next round of bond financing would arrive at interest rates designed to punish rather than support. Commander Ashwick delivered the military assessment in the clipped, emotionless register of a man reporting damage to someone who might be responsible for causing it. The Eastern Garrison is operating at 62% capacity. Equipment replacement has been deferred 3 consecutive quarters. Morale is problematic. Define problematic, Caedric said. Men who are not paid on time develop loyalties that are available for purchase. The statement landed on Caedric's desk like a dead animal. Unpleasant, difficult to ignore, impossible to misinterpret. Who is purchasing? Caedric asked. I do not have confirmed intelligence, but Lord Marchetti has increased his military spending by 40% this year, and his territory shares our eastern border. Caedric stood and walked to the window. Outside, snow covered the courtyard in white uniformity that disguised the actual condition of everything beneath it. Cracked cobblestones, deteriorating drainage channels, guard towers requiring structural repair that had been postponed because the budget allocated for maintenance had been redirected to service debt payments on loans taken to finance military operations that were supposed to generate territorial revenue but had instead produced only territorial resentment. The Empire was a machine running on momentum rather than fuel. It had been running that way for longer than Caedric was willing to calculate, because calculation would require confronting the mathematical certainty that momentum without fuel produces exactly one outcome. Deceleration, then stop, then collapse. What about the Crown? Caedric asked. The Crown's intelligence minister has requested a formal audit of our territorial finances, 3rd request in 6 months. Ignoring it further will be interpreted as obstruction. Let them interpret. Sir, with respect, the Crown does not interpret indefinitely. Eventually it acts. And when it acts against a duchy already weakened by debt and military deterioration, the action tends to be permanent. Caedric turned from the window. Are you advising me, Commander, or warning me? Ashwick held his gaze. I am telling you what I see, which is what Thornmere did 4 years ago, and what your wife did 4 days ago. The temperature in the room dropped. Not literally, psychologically. The specific atmospheric change that occurs when someone speaks truth inside a space designed to insulate its occupant from exactly that commodity. Thornmere was a traitor, Caedric said. Thornmere was right. Those are not mutually exclusive. No, sir, but dismissing accurate intelligence because it arrives from an inconvenient source is not strategy. It is self-destruction wearing a uniform. Caedric's jaw locked. For 3 full seconds, neither man moved. The fire crackled. Wind pressed against the windows with the intimate persistence of something testing structural integrity. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed with the heavy finality of iron against stone. "Is there anything else, Commander?" Ashwick hesitated. The hesitation itself was remarkable. A man who had spent 30 years eliminating hesitation from his professional vocabulary, allowing it to surface in the presence of the man whose orders he was paid to execute without question. "The Duchess," Ashwick said. "What about her?" "She has been confined for 4 days. I am aware of the duration. The household staff are asking questions. The nobles who attended the gala are generating speculation. Lord Hargrove has written twice requesting confirmation of the Duchess's well-being. Ignoring that correspondence carries political costs that may exceed whatever security benefit the confinement provides. The Duchess remains where she is until I am satisfied that her communications with Thornmere did not compromise this household's security. And if they did not, then she remains where she is until I decide otherwise." Ashwick exhaled. "Understood, sir." He turned and walked toward the door. "Commander?" Ashwick stopped. "Your loyalty has been valuable," Caedric said. "I hope it remains so." The words were not a compliment. They were a measurement, a calibration device applied to Ashwick's response to determine whether the commander's recent candor represented honest counsel or the preliminary stages of defection. Ashwick recognized the test immediately. He had served Caedric long enough to identify the specific frequency of threat disguised as appreciation. "My loyalty is to this household, sir, not to any individual inside it." He left. Caedric stood alone in the study. The fire had burned low. Shadows occupied the corners of the room with the patient accumulation of things that expand when the light retreats. The maps on the wall behind his desk showed territories he controlled, provinces, trade routes, military installations, economic zones, rendered in precise cartographic detail that communicated mastery. But maps are not territory. Maps are representations, abstractions, the comfortable illusion that complex, living, constantly shifting landscapes can be captured in static images and controlled through the act of documentation. Caedric had spent his entire adult life confusing the map for the territory. He controlled documents, seals, titles. He controlled the abstract architecture of power, the institutional framework that allowed one man to direct the movements of thousands. But the actual territory, the human beings, the relationships, the loyalty that cannot be compelled, and the trust that cannot be manufactured, that territory had been eroding beneath his feet for years while he stared at maps and convinced himself that representation was the same as possession. His wife had tried to tell him. His strategist had tried to tell him. His military commander had just tried to tell him. And now his 6-year-old son was sitting somewhere inside this castle, absorbing everything with those gray eyes that reflected Caedric's own face back at him like a mirror he could not break because breaking it would require acknowledging what it showed. He poured whiskey. He drank. He did not go to the tower. That night, Merrin carried the leather case through the sea cliff path during low tide, her boots sliding on wet rock, her lungs burning from cold air, the documents pressed against her body beneath her cloak like something alive that required protection. She reached the Thornmere estate before dawn and placed the case in the hands of a man who opened his door without surprise, as though he had been waiting for exactly this delivery from the moment Seraphine's imprisonment became inevitable. "The Duchess?" Thornmere asked. "North Tower, 4 days." Thornmere took the case inside. He opened it at a wooden table and spread the documents beneath lamplight and read them with the systematic precision of a man who had spent decades analyzing exactly this type of evidence. When he finished, he looked up at Merrin. "These are enough," he said. "Enough for what?" "Enough to destroy him, if they reached the right people at the right time." Merrin stood in the doorway of a disgraced strategist's farmhouse at 4 a.m. with mud on her boots and fear in her throat, and the absolute certainty that the direction of her life had just changed permanently. "What happens now?" she asked. Thornmere closed the case. "Now we wait. The Duke's empire is collapsing under its own weight. These documents accelerate the timeline, but the collapse itself was always inevitable. Structures built on fear require constant maintenance because fear is not a foundation. It is a fuel, and fuel runs out. How long? That depends on how many mistakes the Duke makes between now and the end. Based on what I know of him, I expect he will make them quickly. Men who feel the ground shifting beneath them do not slow down. They accelerate. They grip harder. They eliminate anyone who represents uncertainty, and every elimination removes another support beam from a structure that is already compromised. Thornmere looked at the case. Go back. Tell the boy his mother's work is safe, and tell him something else. What? Tell him that when the time comes, he will need to be something his father never learned to be. What is that? Thornmere's expression carried the accumulated weight of a man who had watched an empire built by brilliance and demolished by the same mind's refusal to evolve. Brave enough to change. Merrin walked back to Ravenwyck through the pre-dawn darkness. She entered the castle through the servants' passage. She found Cassian awake, sitting exactly where she had left him, as though the boy had not moved during the entire night. It is done, she said. Cassian nodded once. Merrin. Yes? How many soldiers does Commander Ashwick control inside the castle? I do not know exactly. 30, maybe 40. How many of them are loyal to my father because they believe in him? And how many are loyal because they are afraid of him? Merrin stared at the boy. Why do you ask that? Because my mother told me that fear is not the same as loyalty, and I need to know which one is holding this castle together. Because the one that is holding it together is the one that will eventually let it fall apart. In the North Tower, Seraphine pressed her palms against stone walls that had held prisoners for centuries. She did not know that her documents were safe. She did not know that her son was awake 3 floors below, systematically cataloging the structural vulnerabilities of the empire that imprisoned her. She did not know that Merrin had crossed the sea cliffs in darkness, carrying evidence that would eventually reshape the political landscape of the entire Northern Territory. She knew only one thing. She could not stay. Not in this tower, not in this castle, not inside the gravitational field of a man whose love expressed itself exclusively through control, and whose control was indistinguishable from destruction. She had to escape, and she had to take Cassian with her. And she had to do it knowing that Caedric would hunt them with every resource his deteriorating empire could still deploy, because letting them go would require accepting that some things cannot be owned, and that acceptance was the one transformation the Duke of Ravenwyck was fundamentally incapable of making. She looked out the window at the Black Sea churning beneath the cliffs. Somewhere beyond that water, beyond the reach of Caedric's maps and soldiers, and the suffocating machinery of his dominance, there existed a version of the world where a mother and her son could stand on solid ground without calculating whether the ground would be pulled from beneath them. She was going to find it, or she was going to die trying. Because the woman who entered this tower 4 days ago, the woman who still flinched, who still measured her words against the architecture of her husband's temper, who still carried the muscle memory of 7 years spent reshaping herself to fit inside spaces designed to diminish her, that woman was gone. What remained was someone the Duke of Ravenwyck had never encountered, someone with nothing left to lose, and nothing left to protect except the one thing she would burn every empire on earth to keep safe. She used the bedsheet. Seraphine tore the linen into strips with her teeth and her fingernails, and the desperate mechanical precision of a woman whose body had become a tool serving a single function: escape. The fabric was old, thin from decades of institutional laundering. It ripped easier than she expected, which meant it would hold less weight than she needed, which meant the margin between survival and the 200-foot drop to the rocks below was going to be measured in the tensile strength of thread count, and the specific cruelty of physics applied to a woman who weighed 123 pounds soaking wet. She did not care. The mathematics of fear had inverted inside her during those 5 days in the tower. For 7 years, risk had been the thing she avoided. Now risk was the only resource she possessed. The woman afraid of consequences had been replaced by someone who understood that the worst consequence had already arrived. Her son was being raised by the woman who declared him worthless, supervised by a father who evaluated children the way accountants evaluate depreciating assets, inside a household where love had been so thoroughly replaced by control that the inhabitants could no longer distinguish between the two. That was the worst consequence. Everything else was just gravity. She tied the strips together using knots Marin had once taught her from fishing families along the coast. Knots designed to hold weight against sustained pressure, tightening under load rather than loosening. The completed rope reached approximately 40 feet. The tower stood over 200 feet above the rocks. But the tower was not a smooth cylinder. It was old construction. Irregular stone, protruding joints, decorative ledges installed centuries ago when the structure served ceremonial rather than carceral purposes. 40 feet of rope could reach the first external ledge. From there, the cliff face offered handholds if you knew where to look and did not mind bleeding. Seraphine did not mind bleeding. She waited until the guard rotation at 3 in the morning, the same 12-minute gap that Marin had used, because dangerous households teach their captives identical escape geometries. She secured the rope to the iron window frame, tested the anchor with her full body weight, and climbed out the window into black wind that hit her face like a fist made of salt in winter. The descent was not graceful. It was ugly, terrified, physically agonizing work performed by a woman whose hands had not gripped anything harder than a pen in years. The linen bit into her palms. Her shoulders screamed. The wind pressed her body against the stone with malicious intimacy, grinding her ribs and knees against rock that had been smoothed by centuries of weather but still carried enough texture to tear skin through fabric. She reached the ledge. Her hands were bleeding. Her arms trembled with the specific exhaustion of muscles pushed past their operational limits. She crouched on a stone shelf 18 inches wide, with the sea churning far below and the tower rising above her like the throat of something she had just climbed out of. She looked down. The cliff face descended in irregular stages, outcroppings, crevices, geological scars left by millennia of coastal erosion. Navigable. Barely. In daylight, with proper equipment, by someone trained in the specific discipline of vertical terrain. In darkness, bleeding, wearing a torn nightgown, by a woman whose primary qualification was desperation. The odds were the kind that rational people do not calculate because calculation would prevent action, and action was the only thing standing between her and permanent captivity. She climbed down. Each handhold was a negotiation between her body and the rock. Each foothold was a test of whether stone that had supported nothing heavier than seabirds for centuries would support a woman whose weight had become the total mass of everything she was trying to save. Her fingers found cracks. Her toes found edges. Her breathing became a rhythm that had nothing to do with oxygen and everything to do with the mechanical repetition required to prevent her mind from processing the distance between her body and the rocks below. She fell the last 12 feet. The impact drove the air from her lungs and sent a shock through her right ankle that registered somewhere between severe sprain and fracture. She lay on the wet rocks at the base of the cliff with salt water washing over her legs and blood on her hands, and the taste of iron in her mouth, and the sky above her showing the first gray suggestion of a dawn she had genuinely not expected to see. She stood. Pain detonated through her ankle. She put weight on it anyway, because pain was information, not instruction. It told her something was damaged. It did not tell her to stop. Stopping was a luxury available to people whose children were not imprisoned inside castles governed by men who confused ownership with affection. She moved along the base of the cliffs toward the eastern shore path, the same flooded track Cassian had identified from the mud on her boots. The tide was receding. Water covered the path, ankle-deep in some sections, knee-deep in others. She waded through it with the grim determination of a body operating on something deeper than adrenaline, something more fundamental than courage. The survival drive of a mother separated from her child, the oldest and most terrifying engine in human biology, older than language, older than civilization, older than the concept of empires or duchies, or any of the elaborate architectures men build to convince themselves they control things that were never theirs to control. She reached Thornmere's estate as the sun broke the horizon. Elias opened the door. He looked at her. Torn nightgown, bleeding hands, swollen ankle, hair matted with salt and wind, eyes carrying the particular incandescence of a person who has passed through something that burns away everything except essential function. "The boy," she said. "I need to get Cassian out." "I know." "Tonight." "No, not tonight." "Thornmere, listen to me." He stepped forward and took her shoulders with hands that were careful and hard simultaneously. "Caedric will discover your escape within hours. He will lock down every exit. He will double the guard on Cassian. If you go back now, you will be captured, and this time the tower will not have a window. I'm not leaving my son inside that castle. You are not leaving him permanently. You are leaving him strategically. There is a difference, and that difference is what keeps both of you alive. Seraphine's body shook, not from cold, from the specific physiological overload that occurs when the distance between what a mother's instinct demands and what circumstances allow becomes wider than the nervous system can process without malfunction. "How long?" she whispered. Thornmere's expression did not soften. Softening would have been disrespectful to the severity of what he was about to say. As long as it takes to build something strong enough to bring him home for good, not rescue, liberation. There is a difference. He is 6 years old. He is the most dangerous 6-year-old I have ever encountered. That boy has been mapping his father's weaknesses since before he could read. He is not waiting to be saved, Seraphine. He is waiting to be equipped. She closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, Cassian's face appeared. Those gray eyes, that impossible stillness, the gravity of a child who had already internalized that the world would not protect him and had begun the work of protecting himself. She opened her eyes. "What do I need to do?" Thornmere led her inside. "You need to disappear, completely. New name, new location, no contact with anyone connected to Ravenwyck. Caedric's reach extends across the northern territories and into the capital. His intelligence network is degraded but still functional. If he finds you, he will not imprison you again. He will eliminate the problem permanently because your escape will have transformed you from a confined liability into an active threat. And Cassian? Marin will protect him. She has proven that. And the boy will protect himself. He is already doing it. He should not have to. No, he should not. But the world does not distribute its demands based on what children should or should not endure. It distributes them based on what is happening. And what is happening is that your son is inside a collapsing empire being managed by a man whose capacity for self-destruction is accelerating, and a woman whose influence depends entirely on that man's continued deterioration. Seraphine sat at Thornmere's table. Her bleeding hands left red marks on the wood. She looked at them. The blood was real. The pain was real. Everything that had happened in the last 6 hours was more real than anything she had experienced during 7 years of performing the role of Duchess, inside a castle designed to make performance indistinguishable from identity. "How do we bring him down?" she asked. Thornmere placed the leather case on the table, the documents Marin had delivered. "We do not bring him down," Thornmere said. "We let him bring himself down. These documents prove financial corruption, military misallocation, and trade manipulation, but they are not enough on their own. They need context, witnesses, a political environment receptive to accountability rather than protective of aristocratic privilege. That does not exist. Not yet. But empires built on fear produce refugees, and refugees produce testimony. Over time, enough testimony produces a critical mass that even the most protected institutions cannot withstand. Over time. Yes. How much time?" Thornmere looked at her with the specific honesty of a man who had stopped cushioning truth years ago, because the people he served had punished him for accuracy, and he had decided that if he was going to be punished regardless, he might as well be punished for the right thing. "Years," he said. The word hit Seraphine's chest like something heavy dropped from significant height. Years. Years without Cassian. Years of exile. Years of building a case against a man whose institutional defenses were weakened but still formidable, while her son grew up inside the wreckage of an empire that was consuming everyone within its walls, including the man who built them. She stood. Her ankle screamed. She ignored it. "Then we start now," she said. They started. The years that followed became legend in the Northern Territories, a legend told in fragments, rumors, contradictory accounts that accumulated like sediment until the truth beneath them became both obscured and amplified by the layers of retelling. What is known is this. Caedric Vale vanished from Ravenwyck's reach so completely that Caedric's intelligence operatives spent 3 years chasing fabricated trails across 4 provinces before the Duke reassigned them to more pressing threats. She moved through the kingdom under false names, building a network of contacts that included displaced merchants, dismissed military officers, investigative journalists working for opposition publications, and political reformers who had spent careers documenting the Crown's tolerance of aristocratic corruption without possessing evidence specific enough to force action. She collected testimony the way geologists collect core samples, methodically, patiently, from sources distributed across enough locations and time periods to establish patterns that no single witness could credibly contest. Former servants who had witnessed financial documents being altered. Military supply officers who had signed requisitions they knew were fraudulent because refusal meant dismissal. Bankers who had facilitated loan structures designed to obscure the duchy's actual debt burden. Trade negotiators who had participated in agreements that systematically destroyed smaller competitors through coordinated price manipulation. Each testimony was a stone. Individually, they proved nothing. Collectively, they built a wall. Thornmere coordinated the strategic architecture. His decades of military intelligence experience translated with disturbing efficiency into the construction of a case designed not to win a legal proceeding. Aristocratic courts were structurally incapable of convicting their own, but to create a political environment where the Crown could no longer afford the cost of protecting the Duke of Ravenwyck. The distinction mattered. Legal guilt required proof beyond doubt. Political unsustainability required only critical mass, enough evidence, enough witnesses, enough public pressure that continued association with the accused became more expensive than prosecution. They built toward critical mass the way engineers build toward load capacity, calculating, testing, reinforcing, measuring the distance between current weight and structural failure. And inside Ravenwyck, Cassian grew. He grew the way trees grow through concrete, slowly, silently, with root systems that spread beneath surfaces designed to prevent exactly that kind of penetration. Celestine controlled his schedule, his tutors, his meals, his social contacts. She controlled the external architecture of his childhood with the managerial efficiency of someone running an operation rather than raising a human being. But she could not control what happened behind his eyes. Cassian watched. He listened. He cataloged. Every financial conversation overheard through study doors. Every argument between Celestine and household staff. Every visit from creditors whose voices carried the specific tension of people owed money by someone powerful enough to destroy them for asking. He absorbed information the way certain materials absorb radiation, invisibly, continuously, with cumulative effects that only become apparent when measured after sufficient exposure. At 12, he understood the duchy's financial structure better than most of Caedric's advisors. At 14, he had memorized the names, positions, and political vulnerabilities of every significant noble family in the Northern Territories. At 16, he began making contact with Thornmere's network through coded correspondence hidden inside academic papers submitted to tutors who had no idea they were serving as unwitting couriers. At 19, he left Ravenwyck. The departure was not dramatic. No confrontation, no declaration. He simply walked out of the eastern gate one morning carrying a single bag and never returned. Caedric was informed. The Duke's response, according to household accounts, was to pour whiskey, stare at the fire, and say nothing for 4 hours. Then he ordered Commander Ashwick to find him. Ashwick did not find him. Whether this represented genuine failure or deliberate inability remained a question that Ashwick never answered and no one dared ask directly. Cassian found Seraphine in the capital. He walked into a rented room above a printer's shop where his mother sat surrounded by 13 years of accumulated evidence, and she looked up and saw her son standing in the doorway, tall, lean, silver-gray eyes unchanged, carrying himself with the controlled stillness she remembered from when he was 6 years old, except that now the stillness communicated something different. At 6, it had been defensive. At 19, it was strategic. She stood. He crossed the room. They held each other without speaking for a long time. When they separated, Cassian looked at the documents covering every surface of the room. "Is it enough?" he asked. "Almost." "What is missing?" "The mines." Cassian's expression shifted. A micro-adjustment. The tightening of muscles around his eyes that she recognized as Caedric's tell. The physical signature of a mind processing information that changes the strategic landscape. "The prison mines," he said. You know about them? I know they exist, beneath the eastern ridge. I heard Celestine mention them once to a contractor she assumed was loyal. She was discussing expansion costs. The contractor's name was Merrick. He drank too much at a household dinner 3 years ago and said something about labor that did not require payment. Forced labor. Political prisoners. People who disappeared from the eastern provinces during the territory consolidations. The official records show them as exiled or deceased. They are neither. They are underground, building Caedric's fortune with their bodies. Seraphine sat down slowly. The missing piece. The one element that elevated the case from financial corruption, damaging but survivable for a duke with institutional protection, to something that no political structure could absorb without catastrophic consequence. Forced labor. Hidden prisons. Human beings disappeared into the earth to generate wealth for a man who walked through marble halls above them without ever having to see what his foundation was built from. "We need proof," she said. "I can get proof." "How?" "Merrick, the contractor. He was dismissed 2 years ago after the expansion project exceeded budget. He blames Celestine for the termination. Disgruntled former employees are the most reliable sources of institutional intelligence because their loyalty expired at the same moment their compensation did." Seraphine studied her son, 19 years old, speaking with the analytical precision of someone who had spent a lifetime studying power the way medical students study anatomy, systematically, clinically, with the understanding that the purpose of knowledge is not admiration but intervention. "When?" she asked. "The Imperial Summit, 6 weeks from now. Every noble house, the crown's ministers, the judiciary, the press, maximum audience, maximum institutional pressure, maximum political cost for anyone who attempts to suppress the evidence afterward. Caedric will be there?" "Yes." "You will face him?" "Yes." Seraphine looked at her son. She looked for fear. She looked for hesitation. She looked for the 6-year-old boy who once stood beside her gown in a ballroom while a woman in emerald silk declared him meaningless, and his father's silence confirmed it. She did not find that boy. What she found instead was someone who had taken everything Ravenwyck inflicted on him and converted it into something its architects never intended. Not bitterness, not vengeance, but a structural understanding of power so comprehensive that the man who built the empire could not see the demolition coming because it was being executed using his own blueprints. "Cassian," she said. "Yes." "Are you doing this because you want justice or because you want to hurt him?" The question mattered. It mattered more than strategy, more than evidence, more than the political calculations that had consumed 13 years of exile. Because the answer would determine whether what happened at the Imperial Summit was liberation or repetition, whether Cassian was dismantling his father's machinery of control or simply seizing it for himself. Cassian was quiet for a long time. "I used to want to hurt him," he said finally. "When I was younger, when I still believed that if I could cause him enough pain, he would feel what we felt, that revenge would create understanding. And now? Now I understand that hurting him would require becoming him, and I watched what becoming him costs. I watched it cost him his wife, his son, his allies, his commanders, his sanity. I watched a man with enough intelligence and resources to build anything choose to build a prison and then climb inside it and lock the door from the inside." He paused. "I do not want to hurt him, Mother. I want to stop him. And I want to make sure that the difference between those two things is visible enough that the people who come after us understand that power does not have to operate the way he taught us it does." Seraphine's eyes burned. "Then we go to the summit," she said. "We go to the summit." 6 weeks later, Cassian Vale entered the Imperial Senate chamber wearing black military-cut attire during the most politically significant gathering in the kingdom's calendar. He walked through the center aisle while 500 nobles, ministers, journalists, and crown officials watched. At the far end of the chamber, Duke Caedric Vale stood near the northern delegation's position. Father and son locked eyes across 300 feet of polished marble. Caedric's face went white. Not from fear, from recognition. The specific devastating recognition of a man staring at evidence of his own failure, walking toward him in human form. Cassian carried a leather case. Behind him entered Seraphine, followed by Thornmere, followed by 47 witnesses who had spent years preparing for this moment, former servants, military officers, bankers, merchants, contractors, and survivors of the prison mines who walked into the Senate chamber on legs that had not felt sunlight in years. The chamber fell absolutely silent. Then Cassian opened the case, and the empire of Ravenwyck began dying in public. Document after document placed on the Senate floor. Financial ledgers, military requisitions, trade agreements bearing seals that proved coordinated market manipulation, testimony from witnesses whose voices shook but did not break, maps showing the location of underground prison facilities beneath Ravenwyck territory, contractor invoices documenting construction of detention infrastructure using public funds reported as agricultural development. Each piece of evidence was a stone removed from a wall, and the wall was the Duke's entire institutional existence. Caedric watched. His silver-gray eyes, identical to the ones presenting the evidence against him, tracked each document, each witness, each piece of the architecture he had built being dismantled with the same systematic precision he had used to construct it. Celestine stood 4 feet behind him. Her face had gone the color of old paper. She looked toward the chamber exits. Guards stood at every door. Not Ravenwyck guards, Crown guards. The distinction was everything. The Senate president called for order. The Crown's chief minister stood. "Duke Vale," the minister said, "do you wish to respond to these allegations?" Every person in the chamber looked at Caedric. He stood motionless. The fires in the Senate hall cast moving light across his face. He looked older than his years. The accumulated weight of decades spent maintaining an empire through force rather than legitimacy had carved lines into his features that no amount of aristocratic grooming could disguise. He looked at Cassian. His son stood 20 feet away, leather case open, documents spread across the Senate floor like the internal organs of something surgically exposed. "You came to destroy me," Caedric said. His voice carried across the silent chamber with the resonance of a man accustomed to speaking in spaces designed to amplify authority. But the authority itself had changed frequency. It no longer sounded like command. It sounded like the voice of a structure under load, still standing, still projecting, but producing harmonics that indicated imminent failure. Cassian did not blink. "No," he said. "I came to show them what you built. The destruction is yours. It always was." Caedric's right hand trembled. Once, a single involuntary movement that lasted less than a second, but that every person in the front rows of the chamber witnessed and would remember for the rest of their lives. The moment Duke Caedric Vale's body betrayed the collapse, his mind was still refusing to process. Then Celestine ran. She broke from Caedric's side and moved toward the southern exit with the desperate velocity of someone whose survival instinct had finally overridden every other calculation. 2 Crown guards stepped into her path. She stopped, looked left, looked right. The exits were sealed. She turned back toward the chamber. 500 faces stared at her, not with hatred, with something worse, recognition. The chamber recognized what she was, not a villain, not a monster, but something more common and more devastating. A person who had built her entire existence on proximity to power without ever developing an identity independent of the powerful man she served. And now that the man was falling, she had nowhere to stand because she had never built ground of her own. Caedric did not look at her. He looked at Seraphine. His wife stood 30 feet away, beside their son, wearing simple dark clothing that carried no aristocratic signifiers, no jewelry, no markers of the status she had once occupied. She looked nothing like the Duchess of Ravenwyck. She looked like a woman who had spent 13 years building something real, from the wreckage of something that was never anything more than performance. Their eyes met. In Caedric's gaze, Seraphine saw something she had waited 15 years to witness and had long ago stopped believing she ever would. The wall was cracking, not the political wall, not the institutional wall, the interior wall. The one Caedric had built between himself and every emotion capable of causing him pain, which meant every emotion capable of making him human, which meant every emotion that ever mattered. That wall was cracking, and behind it, visible for the first time in decades, was the face of a man who understood exactly what he had done and exactly what it had cost, and exactly how much of the damage was irreversible. "Caedric," Seraphine said quietly. One word. His name, spoken not with hatred, not with triumph. With the exhausted compassion of a woman who had loved a man long enough to understand that his destruction of others was always, fundamentally, a manifestation of his destruction of himself. Caedric's jaw worked. His throat moved. The muscles of his face contracted with the effort of containing something that had been building pressure behind reinforced walls for longer than most of the people in this chamber had been alive. He opened his mouth, and the Senate chamber doors exploded inward. Commander Ashwick entered at the head of 30 armed Ravenwyck soldiers, weapons drawn, moving in tactical formation through the center aisle toward the Duke's position. The chamber erupted into chaos. Crowned guards drew weapons. Nobles scrambled from their seats. Journalists pressed against walls. The sound of steel clearing leather filled the air with the metallic chorus of a situation transitioning from political theater to something with the genuine potential for bloodshed. Ashwick stopped 10 feet from Cassian. The commander's face was unreadable. His weapon was drawn but not raised. His soldiers fanned out behind him in a formation that controlled the central aisle but did not yet threaten the crown's guard positions. The entire chamber balanced on a blade's edge. Ashwick looked at Caedric. Then he looked at Cassian. Father and son. Identical eyes. Opposite sides of a divide that had been widening for 19 years and had finally reached the dimension where it could no longer be crossed by anything except a choice. Ashwick's hand tightened on his weapon. The chamber held its breath. Ashwick lowered his weapon. The movement was slow, deliberate, performed with the mechanical precision of a man who had spent 30 years making decisions under fire and understood that the difference between catastrophe and resolution often lived inside a single gesture executed at the correct speed. Too fast, and the crowned guards would interpret it as a feint. Too slow, and his own soldiers would lose confidence in the chain of command. The exact tempo he chose communicated something that language could not have delivered with equivalent clarity. It communicated choice. His soldiers watched. 30 men trained to follow the commander's body before they followed his words, because in combat situations, words arrive too late, and bodies tell the truth that mouths are still formulating. When Ashwick's weapon dropped, their weapons dropped. Not simultaneously. In sequence. A cascade of steel returning to leather that rippled through the formation like a signal propagating through a nervous system. One man reading the next, each individual decision reinforcing the collective direction until the entire unit had shifted from tactical posture to something that resembled standing down without anyone having issued the explicit order. The chamber exhaled. Not literally, but the atmospheric pressure changed. The specific tension that fills enclosed spaces when armed men face one another across distances short enough for bullets to arrive before decisions. That tension released with an almost audible decompression, like a seal breaking on a container that had been pressurized beyond its design tolerance. Ashwick looked at Caedric. The Duke stood motionless. His silver-gray eyes moved from his commander to his soldiers to the crowned guards still holding defensive positions along the chamber walls. The calculation behind those eyes was visible to anyone who had spent enough time observing Caedric Vale to recognize the specific rhythm of a mind evaluating options with the speed and detachment of machinery designed to process strategic variables without the interference of emotional input. But the machinery was malfunctioning. The options it was processing had collapsed. Military intervention, neutralized by Ashwick's defection. Political maneuvering, impossible with 500 witnesses and a Senate floor covered in evidence. Institutional protection, evaporated the moment crowned guards sealed the exits instead of Ravenwyck guards. The entire strategic landscape that Caedric had spent decades constructing and maintaining and defending with every resource at his disposal had been reduced to a single, unbearable variable: himself. Standing alone in a room full of people who had feared him for years and were now watching that fear transform into something else. Not courage, not defiance, something quieter and more devastating. The collective recognition that the man they had been afraid of was not the man standing in front of them. The man they had been afraid of was a construction, an institutional projection assembled from military force, economic leverage, and the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened the illusion. Remove the institution, and what remained was a 53-year-old man with trembling hands and silver-gray eyes that had finally run out of surfaces to look at, that did not reflect the truth. "Commander," Caedric said. His voice was steady. The vocal control of a lifetime's practice, holding together a sound that every nerve in his body was trying to fracture. Ashwick met his gaze. "I served you for 30 years, Ashwick said. "I followed orders that cost men their lives because I believed the man giving those orders understood something I did not, that the sacrifices served a purpose larger than any individual, that the empire you were building justified the damage required to build it." He paused. "I was wrong. The empire you built served one purpose. It kept you from having to feel anything, and the cost of your numbness was paid by every person who made the mistake of standing close enough to matter." Caedric did not respond. The crown's chief minister stepped forward. "Duke Vale, by authority of the crown and the imperial senate, you are hereby placed under formal investigation for financial malfeasance, military misappropriation, trade manipulation, and the unlawful detention of political prisoners. Your territorial authorities are suspended effective immediately. Your military forces are to be disarmed and placed under crown command. Do you understand these terms?" Caedric looked at the minister. Then he looked at Cassian. His son stood 20 feet away with the leather case still open, and 47 witnesses arrayed behind him like a human architecture of accountability. Each person a load-bearing element in a structure designed to support truth rather than power. Cassian's expression had not changed since Ashwick entered. The same controlled stillness, the same gray eyes, the same absence of theatrical emotion that most people would have expected from a son confronting the father who abandoned him. But Seraphine saw it. She stood close enough to see the thing no one else in the chamber could detect: the faint tremor along Cassian's jaw, the micro-contraction of muscles around his eyes, the nearly invisible rhythm of breathing that was slightly too controlled, which meant it was being managed, which meant something underneath was fighting to surface. Her son was not a machine. He was a man who had spent 19 years building a machine around the parts of himself that still felt, because feeling inside Ravenwyck had been the most dangerous thing a person could do, and survival required converting vulnerability into architecture the same way his father had done, except that Cassian had built his architecture to protect rather than to dominate, which was the difference that made all the difference, and also the difference that hurt the most. "I understand the terms," Caedric said. His voice cracked on the last word. A hairline fracture in the vocal foundation, barely audible. But in a chamber that silent, where 500 people were holding their breath, the crack carried the weight of something structural giving way. 2 crown guards approached Caedric. They did not touch him. They simply positioned themselves on either side, close enough to communicate custody without the indignity of physical contact. Even in the administration of institutional justice, the protocols of aristocratic courtesy maintained their hold. The system could strip a duke of power, but it would do so with the choreographed politeness that distinguished state authority from street violence. Caedric walked. He moved through the center aisle toward the chamber exit, flanked by guards, passing between rows of nobles, who watched with expressions ranging from shock to satisfaction, to the specific discomfort of people observing the downfall of someone powerful enough that his destruction reminded them of their own vulnerability. As he passed Cassian, he stopped. The guards paused. Father and son stood 3 feet apart, close enough to touch. Close enough for Cassian to see the network of lines that years of control had carved into his father's face. Each line a record of a muscle held too tight for too long, an expression suppressed, an emotion intercepted and neutralized before it could reach the surface and cause the kind of damage that authenticity inflicts on people who have organized their entire existence around its prevention. "You have your mother's courage," Caedric said quietly. The words were not delivered to the chamber. They were delivered to the 3-foot space between them, meant for an audience of 1. Cassian's jaw tremor intensified. 1 second. 2. "I have yours too," Cassian said. "I just learned to use it differently." Caedric's eyes closed. When they opened, they were wet, not tears. Duke Caedric Vale did not cry in the Imperial Senate chamber in front of 500 witnesses. What happened was something less dramatic and more honest, a biological response to emotional pressure that exceeded containment capacity. The moisture that gathered along his lower eyelids was not performance. It was overflow. the body's acknowledgement of what the mind had spent decades refusing to process. He nodded once. Then he walked out of the chamber and out of public life and out of the story the way certain men walk out of the structures they built, not with the violence of demolition, but with the quiet finality of someone who has finally recognized that the building they spent their life constructing was never a home. It was a fortress. And fortresses keep threats out, but they also keep the people inside them from ever reaching anything worth touching. The doors closed behind him. Celestine Miro was detained separately. She did not resist. The specific energy that had animated her, the constant calculating performance of power, borrowed from a man whose proximity she had mistaken for partnership, drained from her posture the moment Caedric left the chamber. What remained was a woman standing alone in a room full of people who had once feared her influence and now could not remember why. She was escorted through a side entrance by two crown officials who handled her with the impersonal efficiency of people processing administrative procedure rather than confronting a human being. No noble intervened on her behalf. No ally stepped forward. The isolation was total, and the totality of it revealed something about the nature of power built exclusively on proximity to the powerful. It has no structural integrity of its own. Remove the source and the satellite collapses instantly because it was never orbiting under its own gravity. It was being held in place by someone else's mass. And when that mass disappears, the satellite does not gradually descend. It simply stops existing in the configuration that gave it meaning. Celestine understood this as the doors closed behind her. Whether the understanding arrived soon enough to change anything about who she became afterward was a question the historical record never answered because no one considered it important enough to ask. The trial lasted 7 weeks. The proceedings were conducted inside the capital's judiciary chamber, a building constructed from white limestone that absorbed sound the way Ravenwyck's black stone absorbed light, creating an acoustic environment where every word landed with the clean, unavoidable clarity of statements made in spaces designed to make truth audible. Witnesses testified. Former servants described household operations designed to isolate the Duchess and control information flow. Military officers provided documentation of supply chain corruption that had resulted in preventable casualties among enlisted soldiers. Bankers presented financial records showing systematic debt concealment through subsidiary accounts registered in fabricated names. Trade negotiators detailed coordinated market manipulation that had destroyed independent merchants across 3 provinces. And the mine survivors testified. 17 men and women who had spent between 3 and 11 years in underground detention facilities beneath Ravenwyck's eastern territory. They walked into the judiciary chamber on legs weakened by years without sunlight and sat in witness chairs and described working conditions that the prosecution characterized as systematic forced labor and that the witnesses themselves described with a simplicity more devastating than any legal terminology. One woman, a former schoolteacher arrested during the territory consolidations for distributing pamphlets critical of ducal authority, spoke for 22 minutes without stopping. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She described the dimensions of the chamber where she slept for 7 years, the weight of the ore she carried daily, the names of 4 people who died beside her from exhaustion and malnutrition. She recited the names the way people recite things they have repeated to themselves every day for years to prevent forgetting, with the mechanical precision of ritual and the emotional weight of something carried so long it has become part of the carrier's skeletal structure. When she finished, the judiciary chamber was silent for 11 seconds. Cassian sat in the gallery throughout every day of testimony. He did not speak publicly during the trial. He had delivered the evidence. The evidence spoke for itself. What remained was the specific discipline of sitting still while strangers described the consequences of an empire built by a man whose blood ran through his own veins. The discipline of absorbing accountability without deflecting it, of acknowledging inheritance without accepting inevitability. Because that was the thing Cassian understood that his father never did. Inheritance is not destiny. Receiving a legacy of damage does not obligate repetition. The son of a man who controlled through fear could choose to build through trust. The heir of an empire constructed on suffering could choose to dismantle it. The child dismissed as meaningless could become the person who demonstrated that meaning is not assigned by the powerful. It is generated by the choices of individuals who refuse to let their origin determine their direction. The verdict arrived on a Tuesday. Duke Caedric Vale was found guilty on 17 counts spanning financial corruption, military misallocation, trade conspiracy, and unlawful imprisonment. The sentence stripped the Vale dynasty of territorial authority, dissolved Ravenwyck's private military forces, seized duchy assets for reparation of victims, and imposed permanent exile from public office. Caedric was not present for the verdict. He had been confined to a state facility during the trial, a clean, spare room with a window overlooking a courtyard where pigeons gathered on stone walls. Not a dungeon, not a tower. A room with a door that locked from the outside and a window that opened from the inside, and enough space to pace and enough silence to think and enough time to confront the interior landscape that decades of empire building had been specifically designed to avoid. Whether he confronted it or not remained something only Caedric knew. By spring, Ravenwyck Castle had been transferred to public authority. Seraphine oversaw the transition. She moved through the halls she had fled 15 years earlier with the specific composure of a woman returning to a place that had once defined her limitations and now served as the canvas for something entirely different. The ballroom where Celestine had declared Cassian meaningless became a community assembly hall. The study where Caedric had confined her became an administrative office for territorial governance. The North Tower where she had been imprisoned became a memorial. Its single window left permanently open, the wind moving through the empty chamber carrying the salt air from the cliffs below as a continuous, involuntary reminder that structures designed to contain people can also be converted into spaces that honor them. She hired former servants to staff the institution, not as servants, as administrators, educators, maintenance coordinators, people who had spent years performing invisible labor inside a household that valued them only for their silence, received positions that valued them for their competence. The transition was not smooth. Decades of hierarchical conditioning do not dissolve because someone changes the organizational chart. People who have been trained to disappear do not immediately learn to occupy space. But the work of transformation does not require immediate results. It requires sustained direction. Seraphine provided direction the way she had learned to provide everything during the years of exile. Patiently, systematically, with the understanding that building something real is slower and less dramatic than building something impressive, and that the difference between the two is the difference between foundations that hold and foundations that eventually betray the structures above them. Cassian refused the title of Duke. The offer was made formally by the Crown's Territorial Commission during the restructuring negotiations. The Vale name, despite its recent disgrace, still carried institutional weight in the northern provinces, and the Commission believed that a reformed heir, assuming modified authority, would ease the political transition. Cassian declined. "I will not inherit an empire built on suffering," he said during the final Senate hearing. "The northern territories do not need a new duke. They need the absence of dukes. They need governance that derives authority from the people it serves, rather than from the bloodline that conquered them." He helped design the provincial council system that replaced ducal authority, elected representatives from each district, rotating chairmanship, transparent budgets published quarterly, military oversight transferred to civilian committees. The architecture was imperfect. Democratic structures built on the wreckage of authoritarian ones always are, because the habits of obedience and the reflexes of hierarchy do not disappear when the hierarchy does. They persist. They resurface in unexpected configurations. They require constant, unglamorous, perpetual maintenance. The kind of work that never produces monuments because its entire purpose is to prevent any single person from accumulating enough power to build one. Cassian committed to that work, not with the fervor of a revolutionary, with the steady, unremarkable discipline of someone who understood that the most important labor is almost always the least visible. Years passed. Ravenwyck Castle stood against the coastal wind the way it had stood for centuries, massive, dark, permanent, but the sounds inside it changed. Where silence once served as the acoustic currency of a household governed by fear, noise now occupied the corridors. Children from the surrounding villages attended classes in rooms that had once hosted political manipulation. Medical facilities operated in chambers where servants had once dressed wounds they were not permitted to explain. Courts of law convened in the Great Hall, where Caedric had once held audiences designed to remind visitors that proximity to power was a privilege revocable without notice or explanation. The castle still looked formidable from the outside. From the inside, it felt like something else entirely. One evening in late autumn, Seraphine received a letter. It arrived without return address, delivered by a postal courier who had no information about the sender. The envelope was plain. The handwriting was Caedric's. She recognized it immediately, the way certain forms of damage leave marks that remain legible, regardless of how much time passes between the infliction and the recognition. She opened it alone in the administrative office that had once been his study. The letter was short. I have spent 18 months in a village whose name I will not write, because naming it would make it real in a way I am not yet prepared for. The people here do not know who I am. They know me as a man who arrived alone with nothing and asked for work and received it because small communities extend generosity to strangers in ways that empires structurally cannot. I work with my hands now. I repair fences. I mend equipment that farmers cannot afford to replace. The work is physical and repetitive and produces results I can see at the end of each day, which is a form of honesty I never experienced inside Ravenwyck, because the results of governing are always abstract, and the abstraction allowed me to avoid seeing the damage. I see it now. Not because punishment forced clarity. Punishment produces compliance, not understanding. I see it because distance did what proximity could not. It removed the institutional architecture that stood between me and the consequences of my decisions. Without the castle and the title and the military apparatus and the financial machinery, the only thing remaining was the man underneath all of it. And the man underneath was someone I had been avoiding for 50 years. He was not a monster. That would have been simpler. Monsters can be identified, opposed, destroyed. He was something more common and more difficult. A man who was afraid that love was a vulnerability, afraid that trust was a liability, afraid that the softness required to genuinely care about another person was incompatible with the strength required to build something permanent. So he eliminated the softness, systematically, relentlessly, until the only thing left was the strength, and the strength without the softness was just machinery, and machinery does not build, it processes. It converts inputs to outputs. It does not create meaning. It does not generate loyalty. It does not produce the thing I wanted most and understood least. Connection. I do not write this for forgiveness. Forgiveness is your domain, not my request. I write this because the boy I failed deserves to know that his father eventually understood what he did, not because understanding repairs anything. It does not. But because understanding acknowledged the damage, and acknowledgement is the minimum debt owed by people who caused harm to people who survived it. Tell Cassian that I know what his name means now. I did not know when he was born. I chose it because it sounded like authority. I know now that it means something else, something I spent a lifetime building walls against. It means the one who sees. He always did. Seraphine set the letter down. She sat in the chair behind the desk where Caedric had once poured whiskey and issued orders and performed the role of Duke with the total commitment of a man who believed that role was the only version of himself capable of surviving. The desk was the same. The room was the same. The view through the window, cliffs, sea, sky, was the same. Everything else had changed. She folded the letter and placed it inside the desk drawer. She did not show it to Cassian, not because she wanted to protect him from it, because she wanted to give him the choice of when to encounter it. Cassian had spent his entire life having choices made for him by people who believed they understood his needs better than he did. The least she could do, the bare minimum of respect owed to a man who had earned his autonomy through decades of survival, was to let him decide when he was ready to hear his father's voice again, if he ever was. She locked the drawer. Then she walked out of the office and through the corridors of Ravenwyck Castle, past the classrooms where children were learning to read, past the medical wing where a former mine survivor was receiving treatment for damage that would never fully heal, past the great hall where the evening council meeting was assembling with the mundane procedural energy of people governing themselves without the theatrical compression of aristocratic authority. She walked outside. The cliff path led to the overlook where she had once stood in the eastern tower, contemplating the distance between the window and the rocks below. Not as an escape route, as an ending. There had been nights during the early years of her marriage when the mathematics of suffering produced calculations that pointed toward the cliff edge as the only variable capable of reducing the total to zero. She had never acted on those calculations, not because she lacked the desperation, because Cassian existed, and his existence introduced a variable that no equation designed for self-destruction could accommodate, the knowledge that her ending would become his beginning, and no mother who understood that exchange rate could accept the terms. She stood at the overlook now. Below, the sea moved against the cliffs with the patient rhythm of something that had been reshaping the coastline since before human beings existed, and would continue long after every castle built upon it returned to the stone it was carved from. The water was not gentle. It was not poetic. It was a geological force performing erosion at a rate imperceptible to any single generation but catastrophic across sufficient time. The cliffs of Ravenwyck were retreating, millimeters per year. Centuries from now, the ground where the castle stood would be open water. The foundations would be underwater. The entire structure, every wall, every tower, every corridor designed to communicate permanence, would be gone. Nothing built by human ambition survives the patient indifference of the earth it stands on. Seraphine knew this. She found it comforting, not because she wanted Ravenwyck to disappear, because the knowledge that it would, eventually, inevitably, regardless of who governed it or what purpose it served, meant that the only things worth building were the ones that did not require stone to survive. Relationships. Trust. The specific, unglamorous daily practice of treating other human beings as though their existence mattered independent of their utility. Those things did not require castles. They required attention. Footsteps behind her. Cassian approached along the cliff path. He moved the way he had always moved, quietly, deliberately, with the controlled economy of someone who had learned early that unnecessary motion attracted unnecessary attention. But the quality of his stillness had changed over the years. At 6, it had been armor. At 19, it had been weaponry. At 21, it was something else. Something that looked, from certain angles, like peace. Not the performed peace of someone who has resolved every conflict. The earned peace of someone who has stopped requiring resolution as a precondition for living. He stood beside his mother. They looked at the sea together. The Eastern Council approved the education budget, Cassian said. Full funding. 3 new schools in the mining districts. Good. The construction timeline is 18 months. Thornmere thinks we can accelerate it if we hire crews from the Western Province. Thornmere is usually right about timelines. He is usually right about most things. He just spent 20 years being punished for it. Seraphine smiled. The smile was small, worn, carrying the specific texture of amusement that arrives after prolonged exposure to situations where amusement was not permitted, and its reemergence feels simultaneously natural and miraculous. The Empire is gone, Cassian said. He said it the way people say things they need to hear themselves confirm, not because they doubt the fact, but because the fact is large enough to require repeated articulation before the mind fully integrates its dimensions. Seraphine looked toward the horizon. The sun was descending toward the waterline, painting the sky in gradients of amber and copper that looked less like color and more like temperature made visible. The light caught the surface of the sea and turned it into something that resembled liquid metal, molten, shifting, carrying reflections of a sky that would look completely different in 30 minutes, because light does not hold still any more than power does, or love does, or any of the things human beings spend their lives trying to capture in permanent configurations. No, she said gently, only the illusion of it. Cassian looked at her. She looked at him. And in that exchange, mother and son standing on a cliff edge overlooking water that would eventually consume the ground beneath their feet. Something completed itself. Not with drama, not with declarations. With the quiet structural finality of 2 people who had survived the same storm, recognizing that survival is not the end of the story. It is the point where the story stops being about the storm and starts being about what grows in the space the storm cleared. Behind them, Ravenwyck Castle stood against the wind. Its walls were the same black stone that had absorbed centuries of rain and war, and the accumulated weight of ambition expressed through architecture rather than affection. The windows still caught the evening light and held it the way old buildings hold light, with the possessive indifference of structures that have outlasted everyone who ever lived inside them and will outlast everyone standing outside them now. But the sounds coming from within those walls were different. Children laughing in corridors where servants once moved in silence. Voices debating in halls where only one voice had been permitted. The ordinary, unremarkable noise of a community occupying a space that was no longer designed to impress or intimidate or dominate, but simply to hold, to provide shelter without demanding submission, to offer permanence without requiring obedience, to stand against the wind without pretending that standing against the wind made it superior to everything the wind touched. The castle was not beautiful the way it had once been beautiful. The cold, intimidating beauty of power displayed for the purpose of producing compliance. It was something else now. Something that did not have a word in the vocabulary of empires, because empires do not build toward it, and dukes do not pursue it, and the entire architecture of domination is constructed specifically to prevent its emergence. It was enough. Far below the cliffs, the sea carried the last light of the afternoon toward the horizon, and the horizon accepted it without ceremony, because endings do not require ceremony. They require only the willingness to let go of what was and stand still long enough to notice what remains. What remained was a woman and her son on a cliff edge in autumn light. What remained was a castle full of people learning to govern themselves. What remained was the slow, imperfect, unglamorous work of building something real from the wreckage of something that was never anything more than one man's elaborate, expensive, devastatingly successful attempt to avoid being known. And far away, in a village whose name was never written down, a man who had once ruled the northern territories mended a stranger's fence with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Not because the trembling was cured, because the man attached to those hands had finally stopped fighting it.